Things are absolutely scary and chaotic right now, but don't panic, organize. It has never been more important to remember that workers fundamentally do have power, and there are things we can do in this moment.
You also wrote a piece a while ago titled, "What Could Workers Win in a New NAFTA?" This you wrote, I guess, like 3 weeks ago, which is pretty wild. But it was prompted by, I think in response in part to UAW President Shawn Fain's op-ed in the Washington Post, that some people, I feel like, kind of took as Shawn Fain almost bending the knee, or him thinking that he could work with maybe the Trump administration during a trade deal. And I don't know where you come down on that question, but there are problems with the USMCA, and it's going to be renegotiated presumably in 2026. So what are the biggest kind of problems with the trade deal between, Mexico and Canada and the United States? And what would a pro-worker trade policy look like in general and specifically with the, North American agreement?
Yeah, so first I should say there's this really widespread misconception that American workers' losses under NAFTA and its successor, the USMCA, was Mexican workers' gain. But really, the only winners were multinational corporations. I mean, wages for Mexican auto workers were actually cut in half between 1994 and 2016. Millions of farmers lost their land that had sustained families for generations, and when they were unable to compete with subsidized agribusiness in the US. So it was really a race to the bottom for everyone. But like you said, we are rapidly approaching the renegotiation period for the USMCA, and it's a really high stakes moment for workers in the US, Mexico, and Canada. So the labor movement did win some big improvements in the first round of negotiations, but there's certainly more to be won if the labor movement in all three countries can sort of coalesce around shared demands. One thing that was won is a tool known as the Rapid Response Mechanism, and that's a legal tool where if a company operating in Mexico violates workers' rights, they can lose access to the US market. And it's a big deal that curtails some major abuses, but there are some very serious limitations. Like, it doesn't address agricultural work where, as you know, labor abuses are so rampant. And it also only applies to the facility committing the violation, not the company as a whole. So if I'm a company and I get caught union busting at a factory, there's nothing from stopping me from just shutting down that facility. So it is a very powerful tool, but it has some serious limits. And another thing, just for context, that was won is that it mandated labor law reforms in Mexico that union activists had been demanding for decades. Chief among them, so in Mexico, many workers work under what we might call a collective bargaining agreement, but it is really imposed on workers by corrupt unions who really just serve the boss. And, it locks in things like the lowest possible pay legally required, like no real protections. These contracts really only exist to stave off an actual organizing campaign. So workers won a secret ballot vote to legitimate all existing collective bargaining agreements in an effort to rid them of these fake, what we call like protection contracts. And only about 30,000, I think, of about 140,000 were legitimated by the workers, which speaks to just how extensive and what a total joke these were. So that frees up workers to either form a new union or join an existing one and win a real contract. So anyway, that's all just to say that there are big things that we can win. But of course, there's a lot more to be won. For one thing, we could expand the rapid response mechanism so that it applies to the US and Canada workers as well. Like, imagine, for instance, Mercedes gets caught union busting in Alabama. We could win an expansion to the mechanism where it could potentially be blocked from selling cars in Canada. We could also expand the scope of the mechanism so that it covers things like safety on the job and gendered violence. And then in terms of further, additions, some workers also really want to see same pay for same work provisions, because right now you've got auto workers in Mexico making $3 an hour for the same work that US workers make $25 or so. And obviously that is bad for both groups of workers. Mexican workers being dramatically underpaid, and also because the boss is going to use their exploitation as a cudgel to, hopefully make US workers settle for less. So the threat of moving jobs to Mexico will always be there as long as workers just across the border are making this much less. So it is in all of our interests to invest in organizing in the Mexican labor movement. And, the more we can do to address this wage gap, the better off we'll all be. And it's one of the many reasons I really believe the only way through in this political moment is international solidarity. I mean, Mexican workers have held really fearless strikes and organized in really hostile terrain. They are building independent fighting unions, and every win of theirs is to the benefit of all of us, because then, like I said, the boss can't use conditions there to pressure workers here to settle for less. So honestly, I think the US labor movement needs to contend seriously with this moment and think about how can we build relationships with unions in Mexico? What would it look like to organize strategically across borders?
Right. I think I can't remember where I read this phrase. I think it was reading Foster, but the phrase goes something like, it's the historic mission of the labor movement to take labor out of competition. And in your article for Labor Notes, you quote Jason Wade, an assistant to UAW President Shawn Fain, as saying these companies cannot continue to be allowed to compete based on how badly they screw over and pit Mexican and U.S. workers against each other. And I think there's a through line there that most people can get behind. Really, frankly, whether you're union or non-union, should competition between companies or within a company be based on how much you can screw over workers? Or should it be based on what kind of product the company is producing? It seems like most people, both as workers and consumers, would prefer the latter. We would prefer that companies do competition based on actually, are they making us a good product or not, rather than are they screwing over somebody in Mexico worse than they could screw over somebody here in the United States? And so, thinking through all of, there's a lot of real room for improvement within the USMCA. What opportunities exist to actually make those improvements happen? I know that there's, because there's a real tension between, how the labor movement interacts with the Trump administration in other situations and how the labor movement has interacted with the Trump administration on trade in the past, and how some leaders, like UAW President Shawn Fain, is kind of potentially working with the Trump administration on trade versus, basically everything else. And I recognize that there's a tension there, while also, having lived my whole life in Alabama, I don't know that I've ever really had a conversation with a friendly legislator as a union representative, right? And so, how do we, and I also think that most people would recognize that the USMCA was an improvement over NAFTA. And so how do we hold all of these things in our head at the same time? Do opportunities for intervention by the labor movement exist as we renegotiate their contracts? And if they exist, how can we, how can we make use of them?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that's sort of the $1 million question, and frankly, a bit of a chicken or the egg, because, winning better improvements is premised on a strong fighting labor movement. And that is something that is, this sort of international cooperation is, we're not there yet. But if you're asking me, I think in large part it means investing in organizers. I spoke with Jeff Hermanson for a piece, that USMCA piece recently. He's a longtime organizer who has a really sharp read of the landscape. And he pointed out that what would ultimately become the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, started out with about 100 organizers, a pretty modest effort. And as a result, we had a UAW, he says, we had steel workers, electrical workers, all of these industries are organized. And he asserts that Mexico is equally good terrain for that sort of mass organizing campaign. So, I think it looks like taking really seriously building these relationships and finding the common ground. Because again, I mean, the silver lining here is like we all largely want the same stuff, right? Like no one wants a worker to be paid $3 anywhere because A, you don't want to be that worker, but also it makes you less safe no matter how much you're making. So I think finding that common ground, I think these unions need to be, talking to each other and thinking strategically around shared demands.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
That's interesting about the, mentioning that the CIO was, at least part of its genesis was in 100 organizers and funding 100 organizers to go live and work in Mexico, or presumably you would hire 100 Mexican organizers. How can American unions kind of do that? Because I know that there are tensions between and reasonably so tensions between the Mexican labor movement and the U.S. labor movement for multiple reasons. For one is, like you were mentioning, a lot of the Mexican labor movement is a movement of company unions, and so there's a problem kind of interacting with them on that basis. But then also, the real unionists, the people who are real kind of dyed-in-the-wool independent unionists in Mexico, there's kind of a hesitation about being tied too closely to the United States. Do you think that hesitation to be tied too closely to the United States, do you think that is kind of falling away? Is there not as much of a issue with that as there used to be? Or does that hesitation and trepidation still exist among Mexican unionists? And if so, how can we bridge that divide and, as an American labor movement, give them the money to hire 100 organizers?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, as much as these company unions do sort of dominate the landscape, there have been some really powerful independent union campaigns that Labor Notes has covered in Mexico that are building, a militant and really importantly, a democratic union movement. So they are certainly out there. And the UE has this great book just talking about how they sort of work to build relationships with Mexican unionists. And it's both sort of like almost like a memoir, but also very concrete with here are the things that worked really well. Here were the struggles. But honestly, I think it really started with, and I think it largely starts with just getting workers in the same room, right? Like cultural exchanges, sending people here, bringing people there. And I think through that, you see that workers here and there are not different, right? Again, we all want the same things. We all want to provide for our families. We all want to be treated with dignity on the job. So I really think it starts with getting people together.
I've said something like this before, and it's not my quote, but that working people in the United States have much more in common with working people in Guatemala or Mexico, or an undocumented immigrant from Guatemala or Mexico in the United States, than we do with, the billionaire class, right? And I said this one of the many times that I've said that on a conservative radio program, and the conservative radio host that I was a guest on his program asked me, what's the number one pop star in Mexico? And of course I didn't know. I don't listen to Mexican music. And he said, and I said, I don't know why. And he was like, I just, thought that was a funny juxtaposition between what you said, you've got all this in common with it. And that is so encapsulating of, I think, the conservative cultural mindset that, you don't listen to the same music person, but you might listen to the same music person as maybe Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, which who the hell knows what they do in their free time when they're not, feasting on the blood of infants or whatever.
Mostly that, yeah.
The idea that if I listen to the same music person as Jeff Bezos, I have more in common with him than I do a Mexican worker is just so wrongheaded. Because what I mean and what you mean when you say, you can correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but what I mean when I say I have more in common with a Mexican worker than I do with an American industrialist is that I am much closer, like economically, to a Mexican worker. We are both much more close to homelessness than the American industrialists, like the fourth generation Ford family member to run the company is, right? He could never do anything to become homeless. And both American workers and Mexican workers are 2, 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 months or paychecks away from losing our homes, right? And so like that is a much more that is a much stronger stuff with which to bind than the idea that I listen to different music people, and so yes, lots more in common obviously with Mexican workers than American industrialists.
Absolutely. But I'll send you a playlist.
All right, thank you. I'll check it out. I was going to be going to Mexico for the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy
cool.
convention that was last week, but the travel for my program was frozen, so I wasn't able to do that. But hopefully I'll be able to go there. I do have my passport now, so maybe I'll be able to get down there sometime. As we're wrapping up, we're constantly on our program talking about, in the last 3 weeks, how the Trump administration is attacking federal workers and the government and what effects those attacks are going to have both on federal workers and on the American working class writ large. And there is so much coming, and I have been feeling, frankly, really overwhelmed in the last 3 weeks, feeling a lot of responsibility as somebody who has a union radio program, who is a leader in my local labor council, and like always feeling like, there's so much to do and I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it. And I know that a lot of our listeners are feeling the same kind of thing. You wrote a piece recently for Labor Notes, Kari wrote a piece recently for Labor Notes titled "Don't Panic, Organize." Can you talk to us about, about the message in that piece and what workers should be how workers should be approaching this moment by, not panicking?
Absolutely. So yeah, as you say, things are absolutely just scary and chaotic right now. But I think the way that we are thinking about it at Labor Notes is, like you say, don't panic, organize. It has never been more important to remember that workers fundamentally do have power, and there are things we can do in this moment. So yeah, my fantastic coworker, Carrie Thompson, wrote this great piece. You can find it on our site. She writes it, the administration's tactics are right out of the boss's playbook. Create confusion, sow division, hopelessness, and fear. They want us to react fast in a scramble and on our own, but together is where we have the tools at our disposal. And there are very tangible things you can do, right? Like if there's confusion over a new rule that comes down, find the source of the info, see if the new rules, comply with existing laws, check your contract. And most importantly, share what you're finding with your coworkers. When fear comes up, talk with your coworkers, let them know that they're not alone and that you have each other's back. I think, the heart of the piece is the labor movement has gotten through some really difficult times. And I mean, frankly, I have no doubt that solidarity is what will see us through in this moment.
Right. Natascha, staff writer for Labor Notes, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.